Thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar, Interviewing: A Conversation About Your Skills and Accomplishments. So just a brief overview of what we'll be talking about. We're going to talk about different types of interviews, such as phone interview, face-to-face, and video. We'll talk about how to prepare for an interview, as well as interview questions that you could ask an employer, as well as example interview questions that an employer might ask you. So first thing to remember is that there is no need to panic with interviewing. Interviewing can be very intimidating, especially if it's not something that you've done in a while. So throughout this presentation, you're going to learn the steps that it takes to prepare for an interview, and you'll also learn the skills needed to become more confident with interviewing. So some types of interviews. The first one we're going to talk about is a phone interview. So with phone interviews, these are typically the initial interview requests that you will receive from an employer. Make sure that you find a quiet space with no distractions, a place where you would have good phone service. And with phone interviews, since they're not in person, you can actually have notes laid out in front of you during this time. And you can also have the company's website pulled up so that you can refer to that during your interview. The length of these interviews is typically going to be between 15 and 30 minutes. Another type of interview are video interviews. So these are interviews that are actually becoming a lot more common, and there are two different ways that they can work. So they could be recorded. Some companies might ask you to submit a recorded interview in substitution for a phone screening. And there will be questions that an employer will ask you, and you'll have to record yourself answering those questions. Another type of video interview is going to be a live video interview. So you might have a face-to-face interview with an employer joining via video conference, or an employer might ask you to join the interview conference as an interviewee. A couple of different examples of technology that are used for this are going to be Skype, GoToMeeting, and Zoom. One thing to keep in mind with video interviews as well is that while you're not meeting face-to-face, the interviewer is still able to see you. So you do want to make sure that you're still dressed professionally so that you're like you would be for an in-person interview. And the length of these is typically going to be between 30 and 45 minutes. And the final type of interview is going to be a face-to-face interview. So these interviews are where you're meeting with a person or a few people face-to-face in an office. So with these interviews, make sure that you bring a couple of copies of your resume printed for the interviewers. Often with face-to-face interviews, what's nice is that you'll actually be able to get a tour of the office as well. And what is good about this is that you'll have the opportunity to see what the environment is like in that office space and just decide from there, you know, if that's a place that you would like to work. Also be sure that you're dressed professionally. And the length of these interviews can vary between 30 minutes to an hour, and depending on the number of people that you're meeting with, it could be 2 hours. So how should you prepare? There's a couple of different ways that you can prepare for interviews. Number one thing is make sure that you do your research on the company. When researching them, make sure that you're looking at their values, the missions of the company, the skills and qualifications that they look for the position, and then think about ways that each of these things are directly related to your own experiences and skills, and be sure to emphasize those points during the interview. Make sure that you also have an updated resume. So with this, you want to make sure that you list all of your current work experience. Make sure that you're emphasizing the specific skills and qualifications that are desired for the position, and make sure that those experiences are going to be relevant to what the position will be. It's important to focus less on what the specific job is, but rather, you know, what the skills that you gained from that job were. So such as communication skills, leadership skills, technical skills. I know a common question that I get a lot is that, you know, what if I have a gap year on a resume? I wouldn't even worry about that. That's going to be really common. So one example that you could include on your resume to help you fill in a gap year is if you were a caretaker for a parent or child. So you could include an example such as a home health aide or a caretaker. These are also still going to be really valuable skills for an employer to see. And then another example that you can also emphasize on the resume is that you took time off work to go back to school. That is extremely common, and this will be something that's showcased through your resume. Also, you really want to make sure that you have a list of different types of questions prepared for the employer. So the first type is going to be 3 to 5 scenario-based answers for questions that an employer might ask you. And then you also want to make sure that you have 5 to 7 questions prepared for the employer. Both of these numbers allow for extra questions in case some of your initial questions were answered during the interview. And we'll discuss examples of these later on in the presentation. And then one final tool that you can utilize is Interview Stream. So this tool can actually be found on the CareerBridge webpage. And this is a really great tool to practice for interviews, but also for those recorded interviews that we had touched on earlier. So you can create your own custom interview. You can take an interview that's already created for you, or you could customize it. So this tool is actually going to be a video of someone asking you the question, and then it will give you the opportunity to video record yourself answering. And I know this can sound intimidating, but this is really good practice for you to become more comfortable with a face-to-face interview, and it also helps you prepare for those recorded video interviews that we touched on. And it can actually just help you feel less intimidated during the interview process. So some scenario-based questions. When you're thinking about answers to these questions, you want to be sure that the skills and experiences and the things you learned from those different scenarios are going to be directly related to the specific job that you're applying for. So the first example is going to be tell me about yourself. An employer is always going to ask some type of form of this question. So this question is a chance for you to let an employer know a little bit about you. When answering the question, be sure the focus remains on your skills, your values, and your experiences that are going to be relevant to the job, rather than the personal details about your life. Another example for this question is going to be a STAR method question. So an example of this question may be, describe a time that you made a mistake. You want to follow the STAR method in answering this question. So you want to think about the situation, what happened, the task, what needed to be done to fix it, the action, what steps did you take to resolve it, and then the result. What was the ending resolution and what did you learn from it? And then a very similar question is going to be a behavioral question. So these are going to be very similar to the STAR method. So an example of this could be, tell me about a time you took on a leadership role. So you want to follow similar steps to the STAR method that you would for these behavioral questions. Now this next question I know can be very intimidating. What is your greatest weakness? This can be a very nerve-wracking question, but what's important to note is that you're answering it still in a similar way that you would answer a STAR method question or a behavioral question. So an example of this is going to be, I am self-aware of my weaknesses. One thing I'm trying to improve is my organizational skills. I've tried a few different strategies, including the use of color-coded planner to keep track of meetings, tasks, and project deadlines. Following these steps has allowed me to keep a record of everything that needs to be done for the week and has helped me come a long way with my organizational skills. So with this type of answer, what you're showing an employer is that, I am aware that I have a lot of weaknesses, but these are some ways that I'm working to improve this weakness. And so you're not telling them that it's completely resolved, but you're telling them that, you have strategies in place to improve this weakness. The number one thing to remember when answering these types of questions is that you never want to say anything bad about a former employer. This can give the interviewers a negative impression of you, and it can lead them to stop considering you for the position. So you want to be sure that the experiences you're discussing are going to be positive and professional responses. So I know I've taken some time to kind of talk about the different ways that you can prepare for an interview, different types of questions that an employer may ask. Now I want to take some time in the chat to talk about some different questions that you could ask an employer. So if you guys wouldn't mind just, typing in the chat and just kind of brainstorming and thinking about this for a few minutes, and then go ahead and let me know some different responses that you might ask an employer. Okay, see one answer. Why do you like working for this company over another? It's a great question. How many candidates are being considered? What was your greatest obstacle in starting your role? That's a great question. Okay, great. Looks like you guys have some really good answers and ideas prepared. That is a great question. What is your leadership style? All right. So these are going to be just a list of very general types of questions that you could ask an employer. So I noticed a couple people asked about skills and what the candidate looks like, what they enjoy about working at the company. Another important question to ask is, what are the next steps in the interview process? And then some other more specific examples could be just think about starting off the question with, I noticed on your website that your company XYZ. In the job description, I noted this. Could you provide clarification for what that would look like? What does a typical workday look like for someone in this position? So with these types of questions, you're showing an employer that you've done research on the company, and that will give them, a really good impression of you to show that you've done your work and are prepared. So some things that you want to make sure to remember. Be sure that you have an updated resume. Make sure that you're answering your questions efficiently and professionally. And then also be sure to practice. Utilize interview stream. That'll help you build your confidence and maintain a more professional attitude when it comes to interviewing. One other thing I did want to make mention of here is I know during this time, some of you may be looking for work. So please keep in mind some different job opportunities. Be sure to continue checking out Handshake for job opportunities. And I know that Amazon also has some positions available. And then also, make sure to check Domino's, Dollar Tree, and your local grocery stores. And as you're doing in your job search and doing, practicing for interviews, go ahead and keep all of these resources in mind. This is the contact information for the CareerBridge office, so I will give you guys a couple of minutes to kind of look over that. And please feel free to reach out to us at any time.